Okay, cool. I think we can get started. If anyone else shows up, we can just let them in as they come in. Thank you all for being here for our NYC-DSA Anti-War Working Group meeting. Today we're going to discuss the war in Ukraine, which has been going on now for over a year since Russia's invasion last year on February 24th. We're joined today by guest speaker Branko Marcetic, a staff writer at Jacobin, who has covered the war in Ukraine extensively over the past year. He has written on the historical outlook of the conflict, the role of U.S. foreign policy, and analysis on Russia and Ukraine. He is based in Chicago and is the author of Yesterday's Man, the Case Against Joe Biden. Whether you're new to the group or not, I hope this event on a complex and often contentious topic will be useful for everyone. And I just want to remind everyone to please abide by our respectful discussion guidelines and refrain from having discussions in the chat while everyone is speaking. So over the past year, DSA has been involved in ongoing anti-war organizing efforts around the war, opposing Russia's invasion and working to push back against our own warmongering political establishment that has continually escalated U.S. military involvement to dangerous levels and worked to diminish diplomacy in the war. DSA has worked to build ties and coordinate with anti-war organizations and left-wing parties and organizers from Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, and around the world to address this crisis. Here in NYC-DSA, the Anti-War Working Group has also worked to organize over the past year with Brooklyn for Peace and other anti-war organizations to petition electeds and call for diplomacy and de-escalation instead of just endlessly increasing military spending. So to discuss all of this, Branko is going to give some insights from his own work and cover some of these common questions. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And we're going to try to get through all the discussion, depending on how long everything goes. I don't know if we can get through everything, but please put any questions you have for Branko in the chat. And yeah, Branko, thank you for being here. Maybe you can start off by introducing yourself and your work and just give kind of a brief overview of the current situation and where things are with the war currently.
Thank you all for inviting me. I'm Branko Marcetic. I am a staff writer at Jacobin magazine. I write about a lot of different things, but a lot of the topics I cover tend to be about war, foreign policy, civil liberties, growth of the U.S. national security state, so on and so forth. And so this war, something I've been following pretty closely from the beginning, and with some consternation throughout. There are highs and lows for sure. In terms of the situation with the war, I mean, it's always difficult to know exactly what the exact battlefield status is because so much of this war is filtered through several layers of propaganda. I think we're all familiar with, the Russian propaganda, but also it's being filtered through US propaganda and Western propaganda. It's being filtered through Ukrainian propaganda. So it's, there's the fog of war, but then there's also very much a kind of, fog machine, if you might want to put it that way, and it's blasting out stuff that makes it very difficult to know what exactly to think. At the moment, the war, there was a counteroffensive by Ukraine last year that succeeded in making Russia retreat and retook some land. Now Ukraine is still, it seems to be somewhat on the back foot. Fighting is around the city of Bakhmut, which is, depending on who you listen to, it's either a key strategic point or it's not strategic at all and it's more symbolic. Whatever the case, this is where most of the hardest fighting right now is happening. That's certainly where Russia seems to have focused its forces on. And it does not seem like Ukraine is doing too well there. Whether that means, that's going to lead to the collapse of Ukraine's forces or whatever, I wouldn't go that far. But certainly a lot of people are dying. I think if we look beyond the lines of the battlefield and that kind of thing, the toll of the war has been pretty horrific. I think again in Western coverage we hear a lot about the suffering that Russia has felt. So I think the latest estimates are something like at least official estimates are something like 200,000 killed or wounded on the Russian side, which is pretty catastrophic if it's true. And I really don't know. It's hard to adjudicate how accurate these numbers are. But I mean, on the Ukrainian side, we've had several estimates now from Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission. I think actually the Norwegian defense chief also said this recently, that they estimate it's well over 100,000 people dead on the Ukrainian side, dead or wounded, plus maybe something like 30,000 civilians killed. Although the line between civilians and combatants in this war is pretty blurry, since Ukraine has heavily been conscripting ordinary people to fight. So I mean, these are pretty horrific numbers for both sides. They're particularly bad for Ukraine, given the fact that Ukraine had, before the war, something like a third, less than a third of the Russian population. It's lost that population now quite a bit. I mean, I think something like 7 million people have fled since the start of the war, so they've become refugees and either gone to Russia or other parts of Europe. So it's a much smaller population than it was. So this is a pretty big blow. A lot of the sort of discussion about how far this war is going to go at the moment is centered on access to weapons and ammunition, basically. And it seems like both sides are struggling. Again, we hear a lot about that when it comes to the Russian side, but also Western officials have been talking pretty openly for the last few months about how basically their weapon stocks have been severely depleted by the amount of stuff that they're sending to Ukraine, that they're having trouble, not just finding weapons, but even finding just ammunition. That they have to find some ways to step up production. Otherwise, the Ukrainian war effort looks to be in severe jeopardy. Beyond that, also, economically, I mean, Russia's definitely taken a blow, economic blow from the sanctions that they've been put on it. But overall, I think it's forecast to its economy is forecast to grow this year at a higher rate than the UK's. Meanwhile, Ukraine its GDP shrunk by, I think, a third over 2022. At the moment, it's running massive deficits. It's basically the only way that the government is kind of staying afloat is through constant Western aid and grants and loans, which beyond kind of the obvious, there's some real perils there, because part of what's being talked about will happen once the war is over is for basically these loans to be used to kind of push through neoliberal economic reforms in Ukraine that have been sort of steadily pushed through over the past however many years, but now would really be turbocharged with, of course, EU membership down the line as a kind of inducement. So overall, I mean, the situation is pretty bleak. What was the whole question? Overview of the current situation. I mean, yeah, it's not a happy situation for anyone, but least of all for Ukraine, obviously. I mean, we also might want to mention the fact that the kind of blowback or the secondary effects the war is having working people all over the world. So, not just in Europe where people have had to weather higher electricity prices and the like, but most of all, in the what I call the global South, where you've had massive increases in fuel costs and the cost of food, and basically hunger and malnutrition and all these things have gone up. You've seen, I think, so dozens of riots around these cost increases. It's led to political instability. The war also in Europe has certainly led to, it's been sort of a catalyst for far right parties to win power. That happened in Italy. I'm not saying that that's the only thing that happened, but the destabilizing effect of the cost of living crisis that the war's continuation has caused has sort of created the instability. It's allowed the neo-fascist party in Italy to take power. It did the same thing in Sweden. I think the far right party in Germany has similarly seen a jump in support too. Yeah, I think those are all kind of pretty crucial things. Actually, in the US, not for maybe the issue of abortion, and some of the mistakes that the Republican Party made, it could very well have transformed into a massive GOP route in the midterms, which would have been pretty disastrous for working people in the US as well. Yeah, so I think I've more or less covered it. It's a very bleak situation. I would not assume that that the Russian gains currently are going to hold, because wars go back and forth. Ukraine apparently is planning a counteroffensive later on, but generally, if you read some of the reporting behind the scenes, there's Western officials are generally pretty skeptical, or don't have a great deal of confidence that Ukraine is going to be able to, sort of achieve some of its more maximalist goals. And I'm feeling pretty nervous about where things are at the moment. Whether that holds, I don't know. Western officials have been wrong before, but that's their assessment at the moment, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that helpful breakdown. I think it's always kind of hard to tell exactly what is happening with the war, especially for people who can't do this all the time, basically, to keep up with all of this information. Actually, when I was in Romania in September, I definitely saw like everyone was incredibly worried about like the situation, and also just like the immense cost of living that it's kind of exacerbated with the energy prices and everything. That was like absolutely the main thing that people were talking about. Okay, and then to move on into the US side of things, could you talk a bit about how US foreign policy has affected the war so far, and maybe you can discuss a bit like what you think some of the aims of the US political establishment has kind of been around all of this?
Sure. I saw a question in the chat, but maybe I'll do that question first, and I can respond to that question afterwards. So yeah, the effect of US foreign policy. I mean, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think it's safe to say that the Ukrainian war effort would not have been as kind of been able to survive as long, or definitely inflict the kind of casualties, the kind of damage to Russia that it has, without the support of the United States, particularly, but also other NATO states. But the United States is the major player when it comes to sending all these weapons. So if you're a supporter of you want Ukraine to go back and reclaim territory, and to be able to fight its way towards victory, that's a good thing. On the other hand, the U.S. policy, U.S. support does come with certain strings attached, and it does mean that the U.S. has kind of really involved itself in this war in a way that far outstrips, we think about the war in Yemen and the US support for the Saudi-led coalition over there, and how kind of important how crucial the US backing is for that war to go on. I mean, and the US involvement in the war in Ukraine is much deeper than that. There's things that we know about, the fact that it's providing intelligence, it's helping Ukraine target Russian ships and Russian soldiers and the like. There's also some things that we haven't heard that much about. There was a report by this guy, Jack Murphy, a few months back, basically, talking about how the CIA is helping some unnamed NATO government's spy agency to carry out sabotage inside of Russia, which accounts for all these kind of mysterious explosions and the like that have happened in there. So that's a pretty worrying step that's been taken. It's happening, sort of without any real public debate. But my point is that U.S. involvement is now very, very deep in this war, to the point of it's almost a co-combatant. It's only by virtue of the fact that the Kremlin isn't crazy enough to want a full-scale conflict with the United States and NATO that basically this hasn't been a bigger deal. But I mean, it's always a question of how long does that hold. Part of the other, because the US is so involved, because the US is all but a co-combatant in this war, the US has been able to expend a lot of leverage over Ukraine, over Ukrainian leadership, and that has meant that that we now have several credible reports that the negotiations that were going on in the early part of the war, from the beginning of the invasion on February 24th to around April, that they were making headway. This is what Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, said. Fiona Hill, who is by no means a Russia dove, she's a national security figure under Trump and under Bush. She said that there was a quote unquote tentative agreement that had been made between Russia and Ukraine. There was reporting in Ukraine itself by Pravda, which is a pro-Western newspaper, making a similar case, and a number of those same sources have said that the United States and the UK have, despite the fact that the talks were yielding fruit, that they declined to support the talks and any sort of negotiated outcome that came out of that, because their view was, if peace came so quickly in the war, that would be sort of a reward to Russia, and they felt like the Russia needed to be punished more. And I mean, there's a split within NATO about this. There's the US and UK and a bunch of the kind of former Eastern Bloc states, which are more kind of inclined to keep the war going. I mean, and again, this is all in mainstream reporting. This is not me sort of surmising stuff. This is what they were talking about. They wanted to keep the war going to sort of inflict a greater defeat or greater suffering on Russia. And there was a bloc of states led by France and Germany that were more inclined to talks. So, I mean, this is what I'm talking about when I say it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, America's weapons transfers have allowed Ukraine to, fight this war perhaps more effectively than they otherwise would have. On the other hand, it has kept the war going far longer than necessarily it may have needed to. Certainly, I think back to September 2022, because the thing I kept hearing was, well, the point of the arms transfers is to get Ukraine to a position of strength, and from there it can negotiate. We got to September 2022, there was this massive Ukrainian counteroffensive, or two counteroffensives. One of them was quite successful. Huge, humiliating defeat for Russia. Seemed like that was finally the point at which Ukraine was in a position of strength. And Ukrainian leadership said, we're not going to we're not going to negotiate now. Why would we do that now when we're on top? We want to, go for all-out victory and retake Crimea, retake the entirety of the Donbass through military means. And I mean, we can look at the result of that. I mean, since September, that's when Russia started bombing Ukrainian infrastructure, which, if you believe the RAND Institute, the RAND Corporation, is more of an economic. It has done more economic damage and a greater economic cost to Ukraine than even the loss of the territory it suffered. You've had, I don't know how many more people have been killed over the last few months, but it would be, I'm sure, in the tens of thousands. Ukraine's economy further deteriorating. So, it's not an easy. It's not an easy choice, but that certainly is one of the effects, because the US, I think the other part of the question was, what are the aims of the political establishment? I mean, the US and the US elite have their own ulterior motive, and maybe I'll scandalize some people here if I say this, but it is not humanitarian concerns and the goal of protecting democracy and human rights and freedom and all the stuff that you hear with every single US-led war effort. The US elite, not all of them, but there is definitely a faction in the Biden administration. I can't tell you how many, but there's definitely a faction that views Russia's invasion, as terrible as it is, as an opportunity to basically lure or trap Russia into a quagmire and inflict a serious defeat on it that will weaken it for years to come. And I think that has basically been what we have been seeing. And I mean, this is one of the things that makes this whole situation very tricky, because though we and most ordinary people may have the best of intentions when we support humanitarian interventions that the US undertakes and the US and its partners undertake, the people that govern the United States have very different motivations and very different goals that they're working for. And it's not necessarily, with the best interests of Ukrainian people at heart. I mean, I direct people to, there was actually, I was looking through some old tweets, and there was a piece back in March 19th, I think, in the New York Times that was based on, a lot of high-level US official sources, and that piece states outright, without any sort of qualifying or hedging, it says, that the US is trying to get Russia into a quagmire. And this was one of the things that I, very early on, I think back in early March, wrote about, when this was being talked about. Hillary Clinton mentioned it, and there were other pieces that this had to be pushed back on, because that is an absolutely disastrous idea for a number of reasons, not just the risk of, nuclear war, but also the what that actually means for people on the ground over there. I mean, if you live in a permanent war zone, you just have to look at Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. I mean, what that means, just constant death and suffering and economic dislocation and disruption, so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think that has been the goal, unfortunately. I think now there's definitely a palpable shift toward the end of last year or the beginning of this year. I would almost date it to exactly when there was a RAND report that was put out called Avoiding a Long War. And that report basically said, a long war in Ukraine is not good for anyone. It's not good for the United States. It's not good for Ukraine. It's not good for our allies. It's not good for, people of the global South. From there, I've definitely noticed there and several other things. I mean, I think the realization that weapon stocks were being depleted at an unsustainable rate, I think both those things have now kind of led to this, to a slightly changed attitude within the Biden administration, where there are people who are saying, okay, we need to get ourselves out of this. This is not good for us. So there has been a change, but that change, came well into the war, after a lot of death and destruction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think currently right now the total US military or US total aid to Ukraine is somewhere over $115 billion. I think around 70 billion of that is total military related spending.
Uh,
And I
Should
think
I? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. Should
Ed had
I
a good
maybe?
question in the
Oh
chat
yeah.
as well, which you might also want to just touch on regarding what Russia's reasons were
Yeah,
for invading us.
yeah. And let me, in terms of my sources of info, I mean, I all this stuff is based on basically pretty establishment sources. It's based on you know stuff that's reported in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. The thing is, there's so much information about this war, but a lot of it is. It's not that it's has no value at all, but often you have to really dig through to find the stuff that to me is the most relevant, especially because so much of it is kind of couched and often this kind of almost patriotic framing that makes it difficult to kind of really get a sense of what's going on. But every now and then, some piece of information breaks through. So it's a lot of that. There's a guy, Ivan Kachanovsky. He's a Ukrainian himself. He's at the University of Ottawa. He's incredibly well informed about all this stuff. Obviously, he's worked on this his entire life. He's a really useful source of information. I follow him on Twitter. I interview him from time to time. He's pretty on top of some major developments that he sees in the press. So that's one person that you might want to look at if you're looking for kind of reporting or just anything that otherwise might slip through the cracks. You read the news. Here, I'll write down Ivan Kachanovsky. It depends on what I write. I mean, sometimes I wrote a piece about some of the backsliding, the democratic backsliding in Ukraine. I talked to various people in Ukraine for that. That's somewhat harder to find because they're not necessarily going to be public. I mean, it's the human rights situation in Ukraine at the moment is not great, so there's not a lot of tolerance for dissent. But yeah, there's actually a lot of Telegram channels that people have taken to sort of be able to air out information that they might not otherwise be able to. At the same time, it's a crapshoot. You're going to get some bad information. You're going to get some good information. It's sort of all over the place. I think just try and read as widely as possible. That's what I try and do. Okay, now what were the reasons for Russia invading Ukraine? Look, I don't want to say that Russia's kind of imperialist attitude towards the former Eastern Bloc and former Soviet states has nothing to do with this. I think that's definitely a part of Russian nationalism that has been growing over the past however many 20 years more. I think when you read some of Putin's speeches, it's clear he does not have a particularly generous view of Ukraine's independence as a state. However, this in the reporting that I see in the US and other Western countries, this is so often played up and overemphasized as the main as the be all and end all really of what's happening, and to sort of create this narrative that basically this war was inevitable no matter what, because basically Russians and Putin himself are just bad and they just want to do bad things, and it's really not that simple. I mean, this very much reminds me of the what happened after September 11, where we were fed this very simplistic story about how, well, the terrorists, they hate freedom, they hate Western decadence, and so that's what all this was about. Now, was that true? Yeah, certainly. You can look at what some of the terrorists, Al Qaeda and other Islamic extremists said, and it's very clear they had a dislike of Western society, of what they saw as Western decadence. But no, I mean, that wasn't what they were doing. If you were allowed to read, the speeches of Osama bin Laden, for instance, they made it very clear that there was there was a resentment about U.S. foreign policy and the destruction it had done in the Middle East. Now, there's a very similar thing happening over here, where if you read a lot of these speeches that people point to when they say, well, see, Putin said in this speech, he doesn't think Ukraine is a real country. That shows you that the only reason he wants to invade is because he's an imperialist and he just wants to create a greater Russia and so on and so forth. Well, often when you read those speeches, what you'll find is that, yeah, he might say something along those lines, but there's often whole sections devoted to his long-standing resentments toward NATO expansion and toward a bunch of US policies. NATO expansion sort of, I think is in some ways the most symbolically charged, because it kind of is a lot of these different things rolled into one. It's represented in the issue of NATO expansion, but overall, it's general kind of objection to Western foreign policy. Now, that doesn't make the war justified. Obviously, it doesn't mean that what he's doing is okay. But in the same way that knowing the resentments of the terrorists who attacked the World Trade Center didn't make their attacks okay. But it is important to understand this stuff, because if we don't understand why something is happening, then we're just going to keep repeating the same mistake. Just to give some substantiation to when I say it's NATO expansion. Number one, I mean, there was a Washington Post report that was based on US, Ukrainian, and other NATO officials, so very much a sort of pro-Western outlook. It's all officials from our side, to put it that way, giving the Washington Post an account of the days leading up to the war. Now, in that piece, there's, I think, 4 or 5 different instances where it is an attempt to sort of talk to the Russians, to stop them from invading. US officials go to Russia and they talk to Putin and Lavrov and other people. And what every one of those officials says in this piece is, that the reason this is happening basically is because of US policies like NATO expansion specifically. In fact, that's apparently what Putin said to Biden specifically in December when they had a video call. He said the reason, as the troops were being amassed on Ukraine's border, he said the reason this is happening is because of the eastward spread of this alliance. So that's one. I mean, and I wrote this piece. I went through WikiLeaks cables, dozens upon dozens of WikiLeaks cables from the 2000s. Looking at what Russian officials were saying to US officials, what other allied officials were saying to US officials, what US officials were hearing from experts in Russia and opposition people in Russia, liberal Russians, so on and so forth. And I mean, again and again and again and again and again, US officials are told, if you continue, first of all, the Russian establishment does not like the issue of NATO expansion. They are threatened by it. They are suspicious of it. It's inflaming Russian nationalism. But if NATO goes into particularly Georgia and Ukraine, which neighbor Russia, and particularly Ukraine, because of the very special, not just cultural and political meaning it has in Russia, but also the strategic position. Russia was repeatedly invaded by armies moving through Ukraine. They're told, if NATO goes into Ukraine, there will be it will split the country. Number one, because the country is deeply divided. It may lead to civil war, and it may lead to Russian intervention, or eventually Russia will do something to demonstrate that it's serious about these red lines. I could give you a million other things. I mean, there was a piece for the Journal of Strategic and Military Studies, I think it's called, by Jeffrey Robertson, who's a British historian of Russia. And he looked at some of the stuff that Russian officials like Putin and others were talking about before the invasion, before they officially decided in late February to invade. And I mean, you can read their own words. say, it's only a matter of time. Ukraine and NATO are becoming closer and closer. Ukraine's military is becoming interoperable with NATO's. It's only a matter of time before they get weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. Now, look, that might be alarmist and paranoid talk, and again, it doesn't justify the invasion. But this is the thinking that was going on, and Putin's thinking. And I suspect that there's probably a similar kind of thought going on. Hold on. I see you're blaming the victim. I mean, I'm not blaming the victim. This is the United States the victim here? I don't think so. U.S. policy here. Remember, the NATO expansion to Ukraine did not have majority support in Ukraine. This has been an elite pushed. Ukraine is, of course, the victim, but we're not talking about Ukraine. Ukraine. This policy has been pushed onto the Ukrainian public, which has not had the majority for this. And I suspect a very similar calculus is happening now that was happening through the Kremlin officials thinking before they invaded, as it is in China, where they're saying to themselves, maybe it's better that we do we wait and wait for when invading potentially becomes much more difficult for us and much more brutal and has much more death, or do we do it now, and cut our losses? I think that calculus is definitely probably being going on, if it was going on in the Kremlin beforehand. Okay, so yeah. So yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think also in terms of Putin himself, I don't really value all the stuff that talks about him being crazy and so on and so forth. I do think there is probably a personal element to it, because Putin himself, Putin started out as a pro-Western politician. He spent a lot of political capital early in the Bush administration to try and align himself with the United States. He didn't really get anything out of it. And in fact, so the US basically disregarded a lot of his concerns. And I suspect from there on, especially as the United States continued to sort of do what it wanted in the region, I suspect they just thought, I was duped and potentially humiliated. And I'm sure that probably does play a role also in the fact that he embarked on this very foolish course. But I would remind people that both this particular war and the war in Georgia that Russia intervened in, both of those happened after that fateful decision in 2008, when George Bush, against the advice of NATO allies, against a variety of advice, made the speech, and he said, Ukraine and Georgia will one day join NATO. It's not a coincidence. And in both this case that we're seeing now and in Georgia, the Russian aim was to sort of carve out a buffer state, basically, between itself and the country that was going to be a prospective NATO member. So you have to put this stuff into context. That doesn't make, none of this is blaming the victim in Georgia and Ukraine, because a lot of these things are completely out of the control of the actual people that live there. This is all elite machinations. This is all things that are decisions that are being made by leadership, above all. But yeah, it has to be understood.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. I think these are all difficult questions to answer in such short time, but thank you for the succinct answers for all of them. I think I'll give you another hard question now. What do you think of the possible scenario? What possible scenarios do you see the war will take from here, and how do you think things might come to an end? I think when we talk about a lot of this, and people are talking about negotiations and diplomacy, and it's always hard to kind of pinpoint the exact sort of kind of things that will kind of come through from all of it. So I guess maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit about how you think things could go for the worse, for the better. Like, what are the sort of different scenarios that you kind of see could play out here?
Well, I mean, at the moment, what it looks like it might end up in is some people say the Russian offensive, the big spring offensive, is where it started. Some people say it's still coming. But either way, it seems like Russia is going to be making this push to get as much of the Donbass as possible, and maybe even go further and try and get some of this the rest of these eastern regions that they annexed before whether suing for peace or what. While it seems like Ukraine is also gearing up for its own offensive, and so what it seems like it'll happen is both these things will take place. There'll be a tremendous amount of killing and carnage and destruction, and then both sides, exhausted, will say, okay, it's time to just end this finally. I mean, in some ways, that is the optimistic scenario. There's several other possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that once it takes Bakhmut, that Russia continues to advance, and that the Ukrainian military effort collapses, and Russia continues advancing. That's one possibility. If that happens, then basically leadership in the United States and the West has to decide, okay, do we basically just take our hands off here, or do we escalate our involvement to stop Ukraine from being potentially overrun? Which in that case, it starts to get into a possible direct U.S.-Russian confrontation. I'm just giving out possibilities. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that Ukraine does a counteroffensive and actually wins back a lot of territory and pushes back the Russians, and then they sue for peace, and there's some sort of ceasefire or some sort of agreement that's made that is maybe not great for either, or neither party sees it as particularly good, but sees it as preferable to what came before, certainly to end this war. There's also a possibility, I guess, that this one's pretty remote if you listen to what Western officials are saying behind the scenes, but I guess it's a possibility that the Russian war effort also collapses and Ukraine ends up kind of advancing and trying to take Crimea, and at that point, again, the decisions has to be in the West. Do we let Ukraine do that and risk a possible nuclear strike from Russia, or do we rein them in and say, okay, hold on, that's enough. Just this is a good time to sue for peace. So those are, I would say, probably the offensive and counteroffensive to stalemate option is probably the most likely one. But who knows? I think the other thing about this is that the part of the reason why, as I mentioned, the Biden administration is more inclined to, is now sort of prodding and pressuring Zelensky and other Ukrainian leaders to try and negotiate is again the issue of weapons inventories. For the US, Russia's kind of a sideshow. The big for the US elite, I should say, for the people in Washington, their big thing is they want to prepare for a conflict with China. That's the real fight. And so for them, they're very alarmed. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Center for Strategic International, the CSIS, it's a arms manufacturer funded think tank, pretty well known, pretty influential in Washington, very hawkish. They put out this report some months ago about how weapon stocks have really severely been depleted, and it's going to take this many years to replenish this particular weapon and this particular weapon and this particular weapon. So I think that's part of it. I think there was a report not that long ago where Biden basically apparently told Zelensky, like, look, you're going to make some gains in the next few months, probably by the end of summer, because it's going to be a lot harder for us to send you weapons after that. So you're gonna, this is it. It's make or break time. So the US, even though we had this big visit in Kiev, and obviously in public, NATO states are all, very much saying we're with Ukraine to the end. In reality, Western governments are kind of making it clear that the support is going to start tapering off. And part of that might be because of the Republican control of the House, but I suspect actually more of it is to do with kind of official reluctance to use up any more resources that they would use in a hypothetical conflict with China.
Okay, another question. How do you kind of respond to some of the criticisms that the left should, for example, be supporting the military aid? And maybe here we can also add stuff like, what people usually say about, like, there can't be any negotiations, there can't be any diplomacy with Russia, those sorts of kind of talking points. How do you kind of deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was very much against US involvement from the beginning, not because the Ukraine's war effort isn't just in many ways. They're trying to repel a larger power that wants to subdue them. So there's nothing morally wrong about that, but to me the risks were just too great. I mean, there's so many. The US often starts these wars and they seem like they're going well. Or I shouldn't say starts these wars. What I mean is the US will get involved in a country militarily in some way, and it's often very limited, and it seems like a great success. And then down the line, there's all these unforeseen complications and things that happen. I mean, Iraq, of course, is a good example of that. Libya as well. I mean, Libya was considered a really great success. Even if you want to go find it, Jacobin published a piece in, I think, 2011, where someone said something like, well, I was skeptical, but actually it looks like this move by Obama to go into Libya was really a great success. I mean, maybe it seemed like that in the first year of that war, but we now know that US intervention and Western intervention more generally is disastrous for Libya long term. So, I mean, the thing I've mentioned before in a lot of columns is I do worry, and I still worry about what's gonna happen within Ukraine when you have this massive quantity of weapons going around, and there is a very militant and well organized far right in Ukraine. That's not propaganda. Doesn't mean that everyone in Ukraine is Nazis, as Putin says, but it is a real worry. When things, God willing, go back to peacetime, what is that going to mean? What is that going to mean for the whole of Europe when you have this kind of far right movement that sees as its goal to spread across the continent and to try and seize power around various countries, not just Ukraine. But even beyond that, I mean, when Biden first started sending weapons to Ukraine, he was asked, should Americans worry about nuclear war? And he said no. And it took, I guess, 7 months before suddenly Biden was talking to donors and saying, well, we're actually closer to Armageddon than we've been in 60 years. I mean, if that to me is a very good illustration of the way that things that maybe are not immediately foreseen, but incredibly dangerous, can come out of this stuff. I mean, I don't want to say it's completely unforeseen, because I think a lot of people would have said that if the US gets involved in a hot war right on the doorstep of a country with the largest nuclear stockpile in the world, that could, especially given what relations between the US and Russia have been for the past 10, 15 years, that there's a very good chance that something like that would happen. But either way, it wasn't really top of mind, I think, and until it suddenly was. I mean, I've talked about some of the other various complicating factors. The way that, as with all wars, the US role starts off limited and it deepens and deepens and deepens and deepens, particularly because, again, as socialists, we might support something in principle or the abstract. We might say, well, what's wrong with the US sending weapons to help a country defend itself? But knowing what the elite of the United States are like, and knowing certain historical behaviors of people in power, it's not exactly crazy to think that this would have happened, that the US was started out with a very, very limited role and slowly, bit by bit, escalated, sent more and more advanced weaponry, gotten more and more involved in the war, so on and so forth, until it got to a point of potentially direct conflict with another nuclear power. I looked at this sort of as, when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary to put down the kind of reformist uprising there. In the end, Eisenhower, who by no means wasn't a communist, he wasn't pro-Soviet. Maybe some of the John Birch Society people would have called him that, but of course he wasn't. His thinking, and the thinking of basically every major Western official at the time, was that, they were so averse to potentially involving the United States into another war, particularly into a nuclear conflagration, that they didn't even send humanitarian aid, which I think is pretty extreme. But that shows you how sort of cautiously they responded to this. In the end, what happened to Hungary, it wasn't pretty. A lot of people were killed, for sure, and the leaders of that uprising were killed. But in the end, the country was not completely destroyed in a war. You didn't have tens upon tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people being killed, and ultimately, in the long run, it was able to free itself from Soviet control peacefully. To me, that seems like a smarter way to go about this, than necessarily the way it's gone, which is, now US officials are trying to find their way out of this war because they've realized it's not really in their interest anymore. I think the other thing is, a lot of the discussion is all about, once the war began, what is the US response, or what should socialist response be? But the reality is, the war didn't necessarily have to start. That's the idea that we're told that this was inevitable, that Putin was going to invade no matter what. But even the CIA reportedly, that's what James Risen, who's a veteran national security reporter, this is what he said, that current and former officials told him, was that, in fact, the intelligence didn't show, in December and January, that Putin was going to invade any second. And instead, what the CIA concluded, was that Putin had not decided to invade until February, and was keeping his options open. And remember, in December, January, this is where he put forward basically that negotiating bid, where he said, okay, here's what I want to, I want you to say, Ukraine's not going to join NATO, and I want you to, I want to discuss, pulling back some of these missile defense systems and some other Eastern European countries, and so on and so forth. And Blinken's response was, no, we're not going to talk about that at all. So there's a very good chance that, if there had been more pressure on the US government to just negotiate with Putin, instead of, unfortunately, we had this narrative of, if you negotiate, then that means you're weak and you're an appeaser. But that may well have stopped the war from happening in the first place. And so I think the better thing to talk about is, what are the proactive steps that not just socialists, but US officials and the US government can take to prevent these conflicts from starting in the first place. I mean, it's very convenient and comforting, perhaps, to tell ourselves, "Oh, you know what, this stuff is going to happen no matter what." But I am not sure that's the case. I mean, I think that's the way we're treating even right now the potential for war over Taiwan. Well, China they want to invade and they're going to do it no matter what, and that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's been a uneasy peace that has held for 40 years over Taiwan. And it's because of a fairly nimble piece of diplomatic work that Nixon and subsequent administrations did that has now been unfortunately eroded by in large part Biden, the one China policy. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is I think another possible response that the US could have done instead of sort of getting involved as it did militarily was to knowing that this war was very much about US policy. Why not step in when the invasion started and say, hey, we're willing to talk about this stuff if you stop the invasion. They could have even put on sanctions and had that as a carrot and stick approach. Like, we're willing to negotiate. We didn't realize that you were really serious about invading this country. Now we do. We're willing to talk, and also, by the way, we'll lift some of these sanctions if as part of the negotiations. I mean, I'm doing some fantasy here because ultimately, like I said, I don't think that's what the U.S. Strategy here was. I think the U.S. strategy was once Russia invaded that they wanted to use that to inflict a defeat on it. But my point is that there are options other than necessarily getting involved in what could potentially lead to direct conflict with nuclear power.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point, because one of the things that I thought was helpful, that some people have brought forth, is that, when the idea of negotiations is brought up, a lot of people just talk about it as if the US is just going to be like, just telling Ukraine you have to, like, give up or whatever. But there's a lot of things that the US could directly be negotiating with Russia around, including things like the nuclear arms treaties. I mean, the U.S. is building a new military base in Poland that's like 100 miles from Russia's border right now. They deployed a new nuclear arsenal to, like, upgrade their weapons in Europe. I mean, there's like U.S. troops all over Europe, U.S. missiles. There was talks that Finland might host nuclear weapons if they join NATO. I mean, there's like lots of things I feel like in general that you can point to and say that the U.S. could be engaging on.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one other thing I'd mention as well. I think this goes for both DSA, but also the wider conversation in the United States and the West, which is, and no one's ever really given me a good answer for this, which is what is the standard by which? Because I think I'm not a pacifist, but I think that the support for military intervention has to clear a very high bar. It really has to be the absolute last resort when everything else has been exhausted, which I don't think was done at all in this war. But if people want to, support, basically what Biden policy has been in Ukraine throughout this war, that's completely legitimate. But I think there needs to be some sort of discussion, or at least some sort of establishment of what exactly are the standards by which it's decided to do this, because it's never been explained to me why, say, as far as I know, DSA has not taken the position of we should be sending weapons to the Houthis in Yemen to fight the Saudis. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've not seen it. I've not seen socialists anywhere talk about, or at least socialist organizations talking about the way to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to pour arms into Palestinian territories, which, by the way, I think would be a disastrous idea. But I don't see why that's not part of the question. When Azerbaijan invaded Armenia, there was no talk about sending weapons into Armenia to in fact, actually, the US stayed out of that militarily, and they helped to broker some sort of a very uneasy ceasefire, but a ceasefire nonetheless. I mean, if Israel invade or attacks Iran with U.S. support is the socialist position to send weapons to Iran to fight Israel. With the U.S. invasion of Iraq, for instance, would the position have been let's send weapons into Iraq let's fundraise to send weapons into Iraq to fight U.S. soldiers. Maybe the answer to all those things is yes, but I have not heard any of those things before, and so it puzzles me slightly. What exactly is the standard by which people decide, ignoring all these other conflicts and sort of taking a non-military interventionist approach to every other conflict is totally fine, but to do so for this particular war is a grave crime and, completely unacceptable, which I think, often when people use those kinds of terms, it's kind of not very helpful to debate. It seems to be more of a way to shut down debate. But yeah, I think there should be, both in the US generally, but also among socialists, there should be some debate about, okay, if this is going to be the policy going forward, there has to be some sort of standards, some clear, coherent reasoning for why the US involves itself in one conflict, or why socialists might support US involvement in a conflict and not in others. Otherwise, it seems sometimes to me like people are just responding to some of the climate and quite understandably responding to some of the really terrible emotional toll of watching this stuff happen. But there's terrible stuff happening everywhere, which doesn't seem to have quite the same toll on people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Socialist lobbying for increased U.S. military spending is probably not the most useful thing, in my opinion. And this kind of brings me into this next question of what do you think is like the most useful thing that socialists in the U.S. can be doing to organize around this? Ed had another question here related, like, does the U.S. left and peace movement, could they have done anything different before the invasion? Yeah, like in terms of like organizing more kind of concrete sort of things we should be working on. What do you kind of think is the most?
Yeah, and I do want to go back and answer some of these questions that have piled up here, but I'll go with that one first. So what's the most useful thing? I think there was someone earlier who said, this is all about blaming the victim. It's about saying the US is bad. It's not. We can talk until we're blue in the face about why Russia is bad and why what it's doing is bad, and that would all be true. But no one in this call lives in Russia. They're not citizens of Russia, as far as I'm aware. I certainly am not. I live in the United States, but I'm a New Zealander. I have no, and I write for a publication that is overwhelmingly catered to a US audience, and beyond that, English-speaking audiences, but primarily a US audience. So, Chomsky used to have this formulation about how you are morally responsible for the crimes of your government. I would frame it a different way. I don't know if it's so much moral responsibility, but I think in terms of what are you actually able to affect, right? None of us here is able to go to the Kremlin and talk to Putin and say, hey, you should really stop what you're doing, because it's not only evil, but it's also just incredibly stupid and pointless. I'm sure there's people out there who would say, oh yeah, no, absolutely, you can. Isn't Putin, don't you have a direct line to Putin? But of course, in reality, no, none of us can do that. We have no real control over what Russia's doing. And some of that, we don't have any real control over what China's doing. What we do have is we have control over the particular policies that the US government, limited control, but nevertheless some influence over the policies that the US government enacts. And those policies, we know, have certain predictable consequences, particularly because the United States is not just another country. It's the most powerful country in the world. It is still the hegemonic power on the globe. And so what it does on the world stage has ripple effects and affects other countries' behavior as well. So in that sense, having done all that, what is the most effective thing socialists should be doing? I think, someone asked up there, what is the realistic chance for some sort of peace? I don't know, because Ukraine has really, it seems like that idea has completely left Ukrainian political discourse and thinking. I think until recently, I would have said actually Russia, I think, was more willing to negotiate. But even then, I've seen a number of indications recently that they also think now, well, you know what, we're going to win this war on the battlefield, screw negotiations. So it does seem like both sides are pretty set in stone. Nevertheless, this is my reading. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's exactly the case, and I think that having some sort of opening up the space to make it okay to have peace talks, to make it okay to negotiate and to end this war in a way that doesn't end with total military victory, I think is useful. I think making it legitimate to pursue talks with what the US government considers adversaries is important. I mean, it and this should have started years ago. I mean, unfortunately, what's always happening is we're having to play catch up. And perhaps that relates to that final question. But in terms of what the peace movement could do, I mean, over the past at least 7 years, maybe longer, there's been a really, I think, dangerous and not very well thought out kind of consensus in US political discourse, which is that any sort of rapprochement with Russia is wrong morally and it cannot be done. This happened above all during the Trump years. I think it was a sort of seen as a useful way to attack Trump, as if there wasn't a million things that you could legitimately criticize him for. But actually talking with adversaries is good. I mean, if Ronald Reagan can sit down with the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, and figure out some sort of compromise, which ultimately led to the end of the Cold War, then I don't see why the United States and the West more generally cannot do it with Putin's Russia now. I mean, particularly, as far as I'm aware, I mean, the big crime that Russia has done against the United States is interfering in the 2016 election. I mean, back in the 80s, Russia shot down an airliner that killed hundreds of people. How many? Maybe 60 something Americans, including a sitting congressperson. And even so, that was not enough to stop later in the decade talks from happening that ultimately led to peace between the two. So I think, I think opening up that conversation, I think we need to avoid framing the issue as, this is a matter of US imperialism and NATO is terrible. It's not so much even about condemning NATO as about this is a foreign policy mistake. This was done at the height of the 90s when there was the unipolar moment and people in the United States and US leadership thought, we can basically act as we want now, and we'll make the world safer by basically expanding US military alliances. But ultimately, that was predictably, as many people predicted at the time, it did the opposite. And so I think we have to communicate with people on the basis of what's the thing that's most likely going to lead to stability and peace, not just for Ukraine, though that is important, of course. I mean, a war that goes on and on and on and on is not good for Ukraine. Neither is a war that escalates to the point where the country it's fighting against will launch a nuke. But also about just, what is the state of affairs that's going to lead to global stability and stability in Europe, but also stability in terms of the economy for the rest of the world, which is also suffering, as I mentioned, from the secondary effects of this war. And I think that's the way that we need to approach it. This war is terrible, and needs to be stopped. So I think another thing that people need to if people really are worried about Ukrainian democracy, I think it's important to know. You should read the piece I wrote. Yeah, maybe I'll put it in the chat here. But I mean, Ukrainian democracy is not in a good place, and it's not. Oh, thank you, Ed. Sorry, I do want to get to your question. Ukrainian democracy is in a bad place. Yes, Russia is one threat to it, but that threat is also coming from inside the house. I mean, Ukrainian politics has been heading into a more nationalistic and authoritarian direction for a while. And it's really ramped up with this war. You can have a read of it's a very long piece, but it's pretty well documented. You know, one of the people I interviewed is a guy, Vladimir Chemeris. He is a human rights campaigner. He's a Marxist. He was involved in basically every major protest in Ukraine, you know, from the protest against Soviet domination in the early 90s to he organized the protests against Ukraine's authoritarian leader later in the 2000s and so on and so forth. So he's someone he has very impeccable pro-democracy left-wing credentials. Yeah, and I think the important thing about that is that the US and the West, you know, NATO powers, Europe, whatever, have enormous leverage over Ukraine right now. That leverage is going to be used, or what they want to use it for is to make Ukraine deregulate, to make it privatize state assets, to make it, you know, do a whole bunch of neoliberal policies, to open up its agricultural land, its very rich agricultural land, to private investors. I mean, I think that's disastrous anyway, and I think that needs to be something that's pushed against, and that's received very little attention. But also, I mean, if the US is going to use that leverage, for instance, to push also anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, which has been doing for years, they should also use that to discourage some of the, to say, hey, well, you know what, we're going to give you aid, but you can't be cracking down on dissidents. You can't be jailing and even torturing left-wing activists. You can't be, you know, clamping down on freedom of speech. I mean, you know, again, these are Ukrainian people who have made this point. I interview them in the piece, and they say, you know, this needs to be taken seriously. It's no good if, say, Ukraine, you know, comes out of the war, you know, victorious or whatever you want to say, but then its democracy lies in tatters, and it's actually moved into a direction closer to Russia. You know, the West needs to sort of stop that from happening, as well as, a Russian victory or what have you. So, yeah, I think there's lessons here for what's happening in China and Taiwan. I don't think China's going to invade. I hope not, but I don't think it's going to invade in the next, you know, couple of years or something, or necessarily even this decade. And so that to some extent that provides an opportunity to start work now to move the United States away, to move Washington away from some of this more foolhardy stuff that it's doing. And look, I mean, if Max Boot, there was a piece in the Washington Post, if Max Boot, you know, one of the most committed war supporters in the US press, is sounding the alarm about the kind of threat inflation that's going on around China, I dare say that there's a more willing or more receptive audience in the United States and other Western countries to hear this message that, hey, actually, no, we don't need to treat war as inevitable, and let's take steps to prevent an invasion from happening in the first place, rather than, you know, once it happens, we end up in this debate about, well, okay, do socialists support sending arms to Taiwan, or you know, oh, actually, if you blame US policy for what's happening to Taiwan, that means you're, you know, supporting China, what have you. Yeah, that work really has to start now. In terms of very quickly, what extent do you think US actions were directed by a desire to break relationships between European nations and Russia? I mean, I think that probably did play a role, certainly. I mean, lots of people have talked about this. Brzezinski has talked about this. I think that was part of it. I don't know if it was, you know, this is kind of I don't think this whole thing was very well orchestrated. I think actually the fact that the US is now kind of very belatedly trying to get itself out of this war shows that a lot of this is kind of being done on a bit of an ad hoc basis. And I mean that's part of the danger of it. I think there's been no real planning about this, not much thought. Very little public debate, which means that certain reckless actions have been taken that might otherwise have been avoided. Is there a parallel to the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, with Vietnam getting military and financial support from Russia? I mean, this is one of the examples that people have pointed out, that they've said, well, hold on, is it bad for Russia or for the Soviet Union to have sent arms to Vietnam? Well, I mean, I will say that to begin with, Khrushchev was actually not really that into sending arms. I think because of the experience over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was worried about kind of starting another conflict. Obviously, later Soviet leaders were not as reluctant to do so. That did not lead to disaster. I mean, I'll say there's two differences there. I mean, I think Vietnam's relationship to the United States is very different to Ukraine's relationship to Russia. Not just the fact that geographically Ukraine is right next to Russia, and so is viewed as a core interest, but again, also the fact that Ukraine does have this very particular, cultural and political role in Soviet, or not Soviet, in Russian thinking. I think makes it a little more unique. But that's certainly. You might say, if you're discussing about when should socialists support arms transfers, you might say, well, look, that was a left-wing nationalist movement, and we wanted to support it for that reason. I don't know if that's the position I would take, but that I think is not an illegitimate line of argument. If you were trying to set out some sort of ground rules for when socialists should support intervention. Do I believe cutting military aid to Ukraine will lead to Ukrainian military defeat? Probably, but I mean, I think it's also important to note that even if military aid keeps going, it's not necessarily going to, I mean, the war right now is not going very well for Ukraine, not just in terms of some of these very small incremental gains that Russia's making, but also, again, if you look at the war in terms of the amount of people that have died in Ukraine, the amount of just social and economic disruption, the destruction of the country. I mean, it's as it is, it's not going particularly well. And even if I think Ukraine gets something out of this that you can call a victory, I mean, a victory standing on top of a pile of ash, it's a very Pyrrhic victory. Was there a realistic path to peace? Is there one? Yeah, like I said, I don't know. I think even if both sides seem reluctant, I don't think there's. I think it's valuable to still call for ceasefire, for talks. Again, the United States can take a far more active role in this. Who's to say that again, I'm fantasizing here, but could the U.S. government not say to China, "Hey, both of us are to some extent kind of the chief patrons of each side of this war. We both want to end. Why don't we come together and mediate some sort of talks?" Unfortunately, when China put forward its peace plan some time ago, a month or so ago, both Russia and Ukraine reacted positively towards it. And Blinken's response was, that this is not serious, and the China isn't really interested, and this is not. There's no point talking about peace right now. So I mean, I think yes, there's problems with the other country's leadership, the other war parties, or the other parties that are involved in this war. But again, there needs to be far more pressure, I think, put on the U.S. government. And I think part of that is, I really think, in many ways, given how contentious it's become, and given actually how, in many ways, pointless the debate over arms transfers has been for the better part of a year, because it's been very bipartisan. It's had, until recently, no real signs of slowing down. I think a much better thing to focus on is, say, organizing call-ins and letter writing campaigns for members of Congress to say, hey, actually there is a constituency that wants peace, that wants you guys to talk, that doesn't want this thing to go on. Because I think at the moment, a lot of people in power think that oh, actually the public is, will get punished. I mean, everyone, I think, saw that response to the letter calling for diplomacy and how crazy and over the top it was, and that just scared everyone away. I think it's really important to demonstrate to people in power that, hey, actually, no, there is a really significant base of support for engaging diplomatically in Russia, not just in this war, but just generally. I mean, all these arms control agreements have been ripped up, not just by Putin, but by Trump and then Bush, and it'll be good to get talks on that going again. Okay, can we end up with a permanent armistice of the Korean War? I mean, that is sort of what seems like it might end up being the most likely case. But again, that I think it's not good enough to just hope that that's going to happen. I think we have to work actively to make that happen. There was a final one. Yeah. So talk about arming or funding Sandinistas and the Cubans. I mean, again, yeah, it's a discussion that people have to work out for themselves. But I mean, I'm not familiar with any US cause among the left, at least, unless, certain fringe groups that was talking about, sending weapons to Vietnam or sending weapons to Sandinistas. I think that the demand was always, let's take the US role out of this. Let's stop the US from basically being, funding and supplying the wrong side. But again, it's something that I think is worth having a debate about and having a discussion about. Okay, I think I've got everything. Did I miss anything?
No, thank you. I think that's great. Thank you for addressing all of these tough questions. Yeah, we're coming up at our end actually, so I hope this was useful to everyone, and I think regardless of everyone's kind of specific stances, I think we should all kind of understand the need for pushing back, especially against the very kind of reductive warmongering rhetoric in the mainstream that has been so predominant over the past year. And I think we're seeing some general movement on that in the US and in Europe and kind of around the world, which I think has been good lately. And yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to check out Branko's recent articles that we sent out and follow his work. It's been certainly helpful to us, especially in the DSA International Committee over the past year. We'll post this recording online as well afterwards for everyone who couldn't make it. And if everyone wants to share it, we'll send it out. And yeah, thank you all for coming. Just two announcements for everyone. There's also a big rally in DC, an anti-war rally on March 18th that DSA is endorsing and will be participating in. So I encourage people to check that out. And there's also this weekend in New York City, there's this big Cuba normalization conference. If people haven't heard about it, definitely check it out. Sign up if you can. It's Saturday and Sunday, online and in person. And I'll just put those in the chat quickly for everyone. But yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording and thank you all again.